Welcome to this fifth and last episode of America with an Accent on U.S. immigration history and law. With a backlog of at least 750,000 active cases in immigration courts, with about 11 million undocumented immigrants here in the United States, and with about 4 million applicants waiting for a visa to become available, we go over the reasons and possible solutions to the situation in a discussion with Paul Stultz, the former Chief Counsel with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, for Nebraska and Iowa, and Shane Ellison, the Legal Director of the Immigrant Legal Center here in Omaha, Nebraska, and a professor at Creighton Law School. Where do we go from here?
I'm an Omaha native. My grandparents were immigrants to the United States. They came here turn of the century from Greece. I grew up with grandparents speaking a foreign language. My mother and all of my aunts and uncles, Greek was their first language. They had to learn English in school in the 1920s and the 1930s here in Omaha. So I've been around people from other places for a long time, and that was one of the reasons I got interested in immigration law when I became an attorney. I've been practicing 35 years immigration law in Nebraska and Iowa, Creighton University Law School. I was a Fulbright Scholar at Kabul University in 1978. Afghanistan, yes. And I've represented foreign nationals, aliens, in court when I was in private practice and in visa petitions and things like that. And then I represented the government for 30 years, handling immigration cases, worked on national security cases. I worked at our command center in Washington, D.C. in 2001 after the terrorist attacks on the Twin Towers. I've had just a multitude of experiences with the government. I've worked in Washington, at our headquarters offices and other offices around the United States, but I've primarily worked in Omaha and have been assigned here my entire career. I retired 2 years ago, and now I'm doing pro bono work for refugees.
My name's Shane Ellison. I'm the legal director for the Immigrant Legal Center, formerly known as Justice for Our Neighbors. The mission of the Immigrant Legal Center is to provide high-quality legal services to low-income immigrants and to provide education and advocacy services as well. Additionally, I direct the Creighton Immigrant and Refugee Clinic for Creighton Law School. And before coming here to Omaha, I was an asylum officer within the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services in New York.
All right.
Exactly.
So I would like to start our discussion with the topic that focuses on immigration courts. According to the Executive Office for Immigration Review, there are approximately 350 immigration judges serving in about 60 immigration courts in 31 states. An alien is sent to an immigration court when Department of Homeland Security sends a notice to appear to immigration court and to the foreign-born individual after the foreign-born individual is believed to have violated an immigration law. Can you describe very shortly the situation in immigration courts right
There's
now?
about 1 million cases pending. There's about 750,000 active cases. Before I came in today, I did a little bit of math. That with 350 immigration judges in the United States, they can close out about 720 cases per year, each judge. So that would be about 250,000 cases. So that would be about a 3-year backlog to handle only the cases that are pending in court right now. That doesn't include the probably 10,000 a month that are being added to the immigration court dockets. So Shane and I were talking also that I think the cases that are now going in front of the immigration judges, if they have a case set today, they're being set for 2022 or 2023. So that's a long time to be have a case pending in court with no resolution.
Right, Shane?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and I would even just add to Paul's analysis. You know, the 700 case completion goal is a quota that was recently adopted by the Executive Office of Immigration Review, and there was a lot of pushback, both from immigration judges who felt that this was too aggressive as a goal, and also members of the advocacy community that are concerned about the ability for cases to be fairly evaluated on such a rapid schedule. Keep in mind, not every immigration court case, but a number of immigration court cases are people who are fearful of torture or persecution or violence in their home country, and such life and death matters deserve to be fairly evaluated and not to be subjected to a sort of assembly line form of justice.
Well, you have 35 years of experience in this field. When did the situation get so grave?
I would say that post 9/11 is when the dockets really started to grow here. So 1986, there was a legalization, and that took care of a huge backlog of cases in the immigration courts. And then it slowly built, and then in 2001, after 9/11, the dockets started to build all around the United States. And then there was for several reasons. The agency became more aggressive in locating aliens who were subject to removal. Oftentimes, you had unscrupulous lawyers that would file affirmative cases and place their clients into immigration court so that they could get a work permit. And in Nebraska, in 1 year, we would have 1,000 cases added to our docket per year for one judge to handle the docket. And so our docket went from about 500 to, I would say, 3,000 or 4,000 in a matter of several years.
Yeah.
And so that was something that was caused by unscrupulous people.
And what do you mean by that for the lawyers? Is that does it relate to what we hear, that there is exploitation of the category?
Well, there are certain groups of attorneys who do exploit, and they're looking for fees, and they're accommodating their clients because they want to get a work permit, and they're told that if they file an application for suspension of deportation or political asylum, that they can get a work permit, and regardless of the merits of their case, there's really no serious legal analysis of whether the person has a good chance to win the case. Okay. And really that's unfair to all the other people who are honest, law-abiding applicants who just want to have their cases heard.
Yeah.
Have you noticed that observation too, Shane?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what Paul is talking about is, I totally agree that there are individuals who take advantage of members of the immigrant community. Oftentimes, folks will go to a lawyer who's ethical and will tell them, look, it doesn't appear as though you're eligible for anything. And sometimes folks are just holding out in hope that maybe there's something, right? A work permit, something that can be done for them. And they keep talking to folks until someone finally says, okay, sure, for $5,000 or $10,000 or whatever the case may be, I'll file something for you that will get you a work permit. And if at the end of that process it results in a deportation order for that person, and the person has not really understood what they were filing for, that's absolutely unethical behavior, and attorneys who engage in that kind of ethical behavior make it difficult for those of us who really want to follow the law closely and fairly. And so, no, I think everyone loses when that kind of practice takes place.
I'll just add very quickly that there is consequences to the lawyers that do those things, because eventually the Bar Association gets involved, and also the criminal courts do for people who make false statements and misrepresentations.
Okay.
In fact, the person I think who caused that big problem did eventually lose their law license, as I understand it. So.
Here in Nebraska,
Yes.
locally. Okay. How do you think the immigration court can be improved?
I think first of all, the number of cases that currently exist in the immigration court system is too high of a number for the current levels of immigration judges to be able to adequately deal with, right? I think the immigration courts are sort of short-staffed, and the level of responsibility of deciding these weighty cases that deal with very, very weighty issues, they should be adequately resourced, adequately staffed to consider those kinds of cases. And so I think an increase in the number of immigration judges is an important piece to this. There are other things that have caused these overwhelming numbers. Paul had mentioned one earlier. I think another factor is, in some instances, the courts are not managed well. And what I mean by that is, for example, in 2017, President Trump ordered a number of IJs to be deployed to the border during a time when there weren't actually enough cases to keep them really busy. A recent report came out that 20,000 cases had to be rescheduled as a result of that deployment, which was not the best use of those resources. Additionally, the government shutdown caused a number of cases to be rescheduled and pushed around, and that's another example of where there's not been some great decisions made with respect to how those resources are used. And the case quotas, as I mentioned to before, are concerning to the extent that judges are being rushed or forced to make decisions without being able to fairly consider those claims. And so some have called for Article I courts to be created for the immigration court, similar to like bankruptcy or tax courts. So the Federal Bar Association, the American Bar Association have said they agree with this concept of an Article I court. And what that means is an immigration court that can exercise true independence, that's not subject to sort of the whims of the executive branch or the Attorney General.
Well, this is a major reform
It
for
would
the
be a major
entire
reform.
immigration courts,
Yeah.
right, system. Paul?
The obvious thing that people say is that if you double or triple the size of the immigration court, the numbers of judges, that you could speed up the processing of the cases. There could be legislative changes too. So, for example, the thing that we see at the border right now of the unaccompanied children and people fleeing violence in Central America, they claim that they have a well-founded fear of being persecuted in their home country, and if they make a good enough claim at the border, then they're entitled to have a full hearing on that. So there's some talk about legislative change to limit the types of cases and the types of review that people could get. And that's very complex in and of itself because we are obligated by treaty and by international law to give those protections to people that have a well-founded fear of persecution.
On July 16, 2019, the Trump administration issued an interim rule on governing asylum claims published on the Federal Register. This interim rule will limit aliens' eligibility for this discretionary benefit if they enter or attempt to enter the United States across the southern land border after failing to apply for protection in at least one-third country through which they transited en route to the United States, subject to limited exceptions. The rule is currently challenged in court.
And that brings me to the second topic of our discussion, which is the immigration law and the need to change. The numbers here are overwhelming too.
Since 1999, on average, USA admits 1.1 million LPRs every year, with 66% under family-based category, 12% employment-based, and the rest under humanitarian-based, diversity, and other programs. Currently, there are about 44 million immigrants in the United States. About 11 million are undocumented, of which a little over 780,000 are deferred action for childhood arrivals or DACA recipients, and about 417,000 temporary protected status or TPS holders. There are about 4 million applicants waiting for a visa to become available. The U.S. population is 327.2 million.
What do you make out of these numbers? What is the problem problems that you identify as acute in today's immigration law?
Let's start with the 11 million. That's the problem. That's
problem, right?
So in 1986, we had a legalization, and legalization is now a toxic word in immigration and in the political world. But that was the last attempt to deal with maybe 3 or 4 million who were illegal in the United States at that time. And then in 1974, there was a program there's actually legislation. It was called registry. And that was a form of legalization also, where if a person showed that they were in the United States for a certain amount of time, that they could apply for a resident alien card for green card, permanent resident status. So the last legislations that we had was in 1974 and 1986, and there's been nothing since then. Anything that gets passed can't have the word legalization attached to it. Seems like the term of art now is path to citizenship, and that's more palatable to a lot of people because it's not an amnesty program or a legalization program. What it seems that the last two legalization or amnesty programs had in common was duration of stay in the United States, meaning that the persons had to be physically present in the United States for a certain amount of time, and that there had to be an absence of a criminal history. So it separated the good people from the people that the American public might not want to have around them. Okay. So one thing that we discussed with our colleagues was if you just keep with a series of legalizations, then people have this expectation in the future that there's going to be another one. So they come here illegally and hope for the best that there's going to be something that normalizes it. And they say that actually can encourage illegal immigration. Okay. There could be legislations that have passed that makes a rolling number so that if a person is apprehended and placed into proceedings, that they, on a case-by-case basis, can apply to stay. And now there is some law to that effect already, cancellation of removal, but it's one of those things that clogs the courts, and it might be better done by Citizenship Immigration Service to adjudicate those cases on a case-by-case basis. Okay. And then you wouldn't have a full-blown legalization. Okay.
So how about in your opinion, Shane?
Yeah, well, I think, my opinion is that there's certainly a sizable population, 11 million people, for which it's going to be extraordinarily costly and disruptive to both the 11 million as well as their families to attempt any sort of program that involves mass deportation. It just does not feel like a realistic solution to me to round up and deport 11 million people, particularly, as Paul noted, so many of them have long-standing ties. So let's take a couple of subcategories, if you will, of individuals who are in need of protection. You talked about DACA youth, for example, right? Mm-hmm. Many of these people are young people who came when they were very, very young. Some of my clients who've been granted DACA came as infants, so they did not have any expectation of some sort of future amnesty in mind when they came, right? It was something that happened to them when they were quite young. An overwhelming majority of American people feel that DACA recipients should be given an opportunity to get on a pathway to citizenship. We know that this is a group of youth who've been vetted. They've gone through background checks. They have graduated from school, or they're currently in school, and they're making significant economic contributions to the United States. So, for example, a couple of economists have looked at studies that look at the impact of deporting DACA youth over a 10-year period. It would result in about $460 billion in losses to GDP and about $24 billion in decreases in contributions to Medicare and Social Security. So there's a real positive economic benefit of having DACA youth present. And while TPS holders, the economic benefit is not as significant as for DACA youth, there still are economic benefits. And keep in mind, people from El Salvador, for example, they've had TPS since 2001. Honduras, it's been since 1999. These are folks that have lived in the United States for decades. And so it doesn't make sense to use limited law enforcement resources to try to deport individuals like this. There should be a legislative fix that provides a pathway. And in my view is that not just DACA and TPS recipients, but there should be a pathway for the 11 million. And I'll give the case for why I think that should be, right? Okay. Number one, it's in law enforcement's interest to be able to screen, vet, do background checks, and decipher who's going to pose a public safety threat and who isn't. So if you have a shadow population and you want them to come out of the shadows, there's a good, solid law enforcement reason for doing that. As well as what the DACA studies and the TPS studies have shown, there's real economic benefits for many of these folks as well. So whether you look at it from an economic standpoint or from a law enforcement standpoint, there's good reason to provide a pathway to be screened, vetted, and hopefully get on a pathway to citizenship for those individuals.
Okay. Paul? Any thoughts on that?
I can't disagree. Law enforcement wants to know who people are. They want to know what their names are, what their true identity is. So if you did have some kind of program like that, it brings them into our society. It makes them identifiable. They can pay taxes under legitimate Social Security numbers into accounts. They can fill all the jobs that are open, and there just isn't enough native-born Americans right now to do every job that we have, nor do most Native Americans want to do certain types of work. So these entry-level positions are primarily filled
With immigrants, yeah.
with immigrants.
Yeah.
Can I add just one additional point?
Yes.
Because I think you began this segment by talking about the numbers. And we've even heard the President of the United States say, the country's full. We can't take any more, right? And I just want to respond to that because I think there's a misconception there. We're not actually at the highest percentage of immigrant population in our history. The highest percentage of immigrants in the U.S. History, when we had more immigrants as a percentage of our population than any other time, was in the late 1800s. About 1890, it peaked out at about 14.8% of the population. Now we're at 13.7. So we're close, but we're not at the highest point we've ever been. And so I do think, as Paul said, there are available jobs. There are able, willing, and ready immigrants who'd like to take those jobs. And I just don't think it's true that the country's full.
And we're not proposing here, or we're not discussing here, a way that everybody gets that by default you're undocumented. You go through a vetting process.
Right.
Your
You want to have
background
the
check, right?
filters to make sure that there's
Sure.
no criminal history, no warrants, and there's no what we would call grounds of excludability, that you don't want those people here. One of the ones that we would see is war criminals, believe it or not. That's a ground of exclusion from the United States. Terrorist bars. And the agency encounters those people on a daily basis.
Okay.
So there's a good interest in identifying people.
And one question now from a different perspective. You mentioned that there is the fear of setting the precedent and actually encouraging the illegal immigration by passing this reform or amnesty to give a path or a chance for those undocumented to become permanent residents of the United States. Do you see any basis in that? Is that fear?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a totally fair question, and oftentimes, so for example, when the Senate last considered a comprehensive immigration reform bill that would have provided a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants present in the United States, there was a recognition of having certain safeguards and protocols in place for border security and these sorts of things. I think it is, in everyone's interest to have a functioning immigration system that can provide a measure of security as well. There have been some folks who call for the end of ICE or these kinds of things, but I think those proposals end up sort of playing to the opposition's argument, in the sense that I think, as you can see here, someone who's represented immigrants his entire life, or most of his entire career, I should say, and an individual who's represented the government for most of his career, we agree that a pathway to status could be a good solution for this. So there are common sense solutions. A pathway to status could be part of it. Ensuring that there are appropriate safeguards for border security is not a bad thing, but I don't think an exclusively enforcement border security approach is the right one. It has to be in tandem with recognition that there are real lives affected, and a humane solution needs to be pursued.
And there could be deterrence attached with any kind of pathway. So you could beef up the existing laws on employer compliance, that the things that they have to do to hire a lawful workforce.
That's right.
Increase the fines, more enforcement there to make it financially difficult if you're hiring and using illegal alien labor.
Okay. Just like with the immigration court, the numbers tell me that there is a need for some change. There is a need for adaptation in the immigration law.
In this series, the attorneys with the Immigrant Legal Center have suggested a revision of visa caps for family-based immigration, as well as expansion of eligible categories to include family members like grandparents. Modernization of some employment-based laws so they can be responsive to the needs of employers, and the form of immigration reform that would provide protection to undocumented immigrants so they can get on a pathway to citizenship.
When it comes to those two areas, the family-based and employment-based, do you agree with Shane and his organization that there is need for adaptation in the immigration law?
Well, our country has been founded on family-based immigration for the most part. We do have visa categories for unskilled laborers, but the number is so small. That would be one way that to satisfy a needy labor force in agriculture, in simple manufacturing and production like food production, to increase the number of preference visas for unskilled workers. And then you have, we want to attract the best and the brightest also. And so I think it's really important to increase or maintain a level of immigration for people that are highly skilled in the sciences and in the medical professions and engineering.
So you see the employment-based as needing more adaptation than the family-based category. Is that right? Do I understand?
I wouldn't abandon family-based. It's just, it's part of our DNA.
Okay. And Shane?
Yeah, I mean, and just to be clear, some of the proposals that we've talked about previously, you know, the wait times can be so lengthy for certain family-based categories, and a lot of that is as a result of caps imposed by Congress that limit the flow. And so, you know, it would be great to have additional allocation of visas so that families could be reunited in a shorter period of time. But I totally agree with Paul that you know, perhaps, you know, whether it's a low-skilled worker visa category or even a guest worker program has been discussed at certain times to deal with seasonal needs. You know, I think while I don't do employment-based immigration law, my colleagues in the field who do, you know, have noted that processing times are longer than they've been. Businesses see it as a very costly and cumbersome process full of bureaucracy and red tape, and these kinds of things are going to be deterrents for businesses really making use of employment-based immigration options.
We're talking about the adaptation, the family, and the employment-based. What do you think about the plan that the President of the United States, President Trump, introduced to the nation a few days back? He talks about the employment-based category, specifically actually switching or swapping places with the family-based immigration. Your thoughts on that?
He's a pro-business president, and I think that's apparent, and he's probably catering to businesses that want more skilled workers here.
Okay. Shane?
Well, I would say the plan, you know, from my perspective, is very thin on details. And so it's difficult to see what kinds of changes we would see. But my fundamental concern with the plan is that it seems to pursue the interests of businesses and employment-based immigration really at the expense of family reunification. And in my mind, it's a false bifurcation. It's not either you favor businesses or you favor families. I think you can, without taking away from family-based reunification, you could make improvements on employment-based immigration.
Even today, it is employment-based with family addition to that. Mm-hmm. And to me, one person, let's say a family of four, one person will need 3 visas to have the family reunited.
Sure.
So it is a complicated. I was trying to make sense of numbers, and it's a complicated. I agree with you when it comes to immigration law. 25% of immigrant population in the United States, they're undocumented. This population is only 3 to 4% of the entire population of the United States. In any statistical model, this is within the margin of error. The question that I had was, why can't the United States address the needs or agree on a way how to address the need of this 4% of its population?
I would say that before 9/11, that the Congress and the President worked pretty good on immigration issues. And I think that 9/11 was a game changer in terms of American perception to immigrants and how to handle people who were here illegally. I know that there was talk about legalization or changing the laws prior to 9/11, And after 9/11, everything shut down, and everything has been focused on enforcement since then. And so the 3 or 4%, if that's the number, the percentage of unlawful people in the United States, people that are illegally or unlawfully present, there's not a lot of sympathy from many Americans for that. When you meet people on a one-on-one basis, you get to know people. It doesn't matter if they're here lawfully or unlawfully. But it's 9/11 to me was the game changer.
Shane?
I think there's a real political component to it. You know, I feel like the issue has been turned into a political football, and policymakers kick around various ideas and proposals in an effort to win elections, you know, and I think what we saw during the last election cycle was a narrative that immigrants are to be feared and they are the source of many problems and build a wall, et cetera, and that has continued to be a major political rallying cry for the current administration. And I think they see this as a political issue that is beneficial to them, that they can win an election on. If politicians put aside some of the fear-mongering and other things that they think will help them win elections, focus on the issues and do something that the American people want them to do, I think reform is possible. But not until enough people make that view known and hold their policymakers accountable.
Yeah, the mantra seems to be enforcement first. Make sure that we have a stable border, a safe border, protected border, secure border, and then we'll address some kind of immigration reform on the benefit side. Great amounts of money have been put into the enforcement side, hiring Border Patrol, building walls. The walls have been built for the last 20 years. Sure. They have been effective in urban areas, but to put a wall across the entire southern border is not feasible geographically. But in urban area, enforcement seems to be the main stumbling block that people are using to carry their day. Enforcement first, secure the border, then we'll talk about benefit immigration. I'm proud to be an American, yes. And I always try to be as welcoming as possible, and I think that generally speaking, immigration is a good thing for the country. It brings new ideas, it brings new people, it brings commerce. It just, the more we know about each other, the better off we are as a society.
As a nation, we have been at our worst at times when we're controlled by fear and xenophobia. We've shown that we can demonstrate an incredible amount of cruelty, whether that's Japanese internment camps or it's family separation. However, those low points don't define us. And when we're at our best, I think we're welcoming, we're hospitable, and we want to be a beacon of liberty, right? We etched it right into our monument to liberty, the Statue of Liberty, that we welcome those huddled masses yearning to breathe free. And I think that is a part of the American dream. And when we're living out that sort of ideal, we're at our finest.
Thank you both for being here. That was an interesting conversation. This was America with an Accent for this week. I hope to see you again here on KPAO TV or online at www.newamericansmedia.com. Thank you for watching. I am Enkela Vebio.